Stanisław Barszczak, Mass and Power by Elias Canettis. People to people dealt this fate. The essay Mass and Power, published in 1960, is the result of several decades of Elias Canettis' written work and preoccupation with the concept of mass and power. The specific phenomenology of the mass, relating to the time in which he lived and wrote, is not surprising, since especially from the first half of the 20th century, there were violent social upheavals. This age was characterized by various mass movements. The first half of the 20th century was the period of the emergence of large cities. This period is characterized by industrialization as well as two world wars and their consequences. At the same time, it represented a century of flourishing technological progress and, more importantly, scientific knowledge. Psychology and psychiatry gained popularity in the late 19th century and were recognized as scientific disciplines in the early 20th century. A number of scientific discoveries have been made in the field of biology and physics. These discoveries are important and extremely positive for science in general, but the people who lived at the time received them with mixed rather than pleased feelings. Eventually, new scientific discoveries led to the previously known worldview threatening to disintegrate, while at the same time the discoveries often led to a general feeling of alienation and loss of identity. For 20th century authors, the masterpiece was Gustave Le Bon's Psychology of the Masses, which was published in 1885 and thus led to the foundation for later sociology. Social psychology was particularly important. In this way, the author warned that communism is not the last word in society, I believe. Le Bon's fears are directed primarily against the masses, against communism. In his work, Le Bon describes the normal living conditions of every human being, as it were, the human community before the beginning of culture. The works created at that time have one thing in common. They primarily describe mass as something deviant from the norm, as a phenomenon in society that must be combated. Through his works, Le Bon tries to warn against the power of the masses. He considered the mass to be its birth, the entry of the popular classes into political life, and their progressiveness, the transformation into the leading classes. According to Le Bon, this inevitably leads to the overthrow of present society, and thus to communism as the normal circumstance of the entire human community before the beginning of culture. Hermann Brock, a contemporary of Canettis, who had extensive discussions with Canettis on mass phenomenology, also wrote a work on this subject. His unfinished fragment on death is known as the theory of mass delusions, and describes the so-called mass. The author also perceives mass as a dangerous phenomenon, which is compared to a cancer of the will. Decades have passed between Le Bon's work and Brock's theory of mass delusions, characterized primarily by mass murders during the world's wars. See the current murders in Ukraine in our era, Bucha. Therefore, it is not surprising that in Brock's work, mass is treated as a phenomenon that has, above all, destructive power, especially since Broch is a Jew and works as a Jewish writer. Both Le Bon and Broch offer insight into their work, into the destructive aspects of the masses who seek power and rather than sacrifice for it. In turn, Canettis, himself as a Jewish writer, also dealt with all aspects of this matter. The delusional masses of world wars describe the masses in one way, a completely different way. He is also interested in these destructive powers. He intended to show the forces of mass. In his 1960 essay, he reveals only one of many aspects of this problem, because according to Canettis, there is a whole range of possible masses, and each of them differs from other masses in certain properties it has. According to Canettis, a man does not become a man with certain conditions. As a mass man, he has an innate need to be part of the mass to become a man. Therefore, for him, mass is a natural phenomenon, its own dynamics. Under certain conditions, the mass form can easily transform into another form. In addition to the concept of mass, Canettis also introduces other terms into the theory of mass, such as the concept of the mass crystal as the particular appearance of mass, and the concept of packaging as the archaic origin of all human life. What else does his conception of the concept of power lead to? The threat to people resulting from mass mental confusion is an open secret. Polichinelle, see Polichinelle, Italian Pulcinella. It was the character of a born from the Italian Commedia dell'arte. His characteristic features were a hump, a comical behavior, and precisely for this reason he is always an open problem. The mass psychological threat is certainly no less disastrous to humanity than that posed by cancer, and would need to be fought with at least the same intensity as the latter. This was written by the above-mentioned Broch. Canettis' goal is therefore to be better understand both as well as the origin of mass, as well as a still better understanding of human behavior. Another term that is key to the essay is the concept of transformation, metamorphosis, as another innate human property that is increasingly lost in the modern world, so that modern people will be different as a result of the loss of this value. The human mass is transformed into a digital. In an important fragment of a mass and power, the author seems to be walking around the cemetery and reads on the monuments, among others, 12 years old. Here the girl was 18 years old. Here the man passed away in the prime of life. There he was 70, 80, 88, 89. A large number of such people are presented who are created by society through distance charges. Today, science already talks about bilocation as moving a distance of 1 kilometer. Charges are at a distance. See subatomic forces and the interactions in the science of the contemporary can no longer find access to each other, and ultimately, due to this impossibility, we are faced with a failed transformation, failed metamorphosis. In reference to the concept of mass, Canettis also uses the so-called mass symbols, which are not masses but are anchored in the subconscious of every person and lead directly to the formation of masses. See power. This is where the so-called national symbols through which Canettis explained mass events in the 20th century. However, he did not intend to diminish their importance, to express his belief that the phenomena of mass, power and the transformation remain undefined. The author wants to make the reader understand that human nature is as if suspended, so anchored in life, connecting it with human activities and physiognomy, and even with conditions which in medicine and psychiatry are considered mental diseases and disorders. Pathological features appears in a person's actions, in his figure, and seem to be unexpressed yet, I think. Canettis says of these conditions that they are clearly obvious. It is not surprising that in the essay the author continues his entire literary output and refers to the main concept of his work, also regarding human mental states. The combination is beneficial, especially since psychology and psychiatry is in the first half of the 20th century at the center of both science and life, show average and extraordinary individuals. Canettis also offers an explanation of the relationship between mass and power, views different from those presented in other works on the same topic. According to Canettis, there is both a need for mass experience and a need for power, as innate to every human being. Through this explanation, there are given in his essay, man is considered differently. The writer reveals examples one by one, an exposed being in search of power, whose power is expressed in the need to survive as a man. Because Canettis' mass behaves like its own organism and therefore as such like humans themselves, this mass does not always have such power. This latter has one of its own dynamics, which is not dependent on mass but remains in a specific relationship with it. There are certain mass forms. They exert power on other mass forms, as well as on themselves, on individuals within and outside the masses. This is particularly interesting, namely the power relationship in the so-called double masses that only exist as long as the power is equally clear on both sides. See when only one of the individual masses within. So when the double mass takes over, both masses change within it. You can connect their forms so that the double mass ends there. Power must, what's more, and you don't even have to be really present to survive. There is a power of imagination that is unique to man. I am convinced that imagination is not fully responsible for mass as understood by the writer. I tell you from myself here, thank God, the imagination does not fully encompass cosmic distances. Because, for example, how to prove to someone what is the distance, let's say, our Sun to Proxima Centauri, the next stars closest to us, 4.24 light years from us, probably, i.e., roughly 40 trillion kilometers. And Proxima Centauri is a cluster of 3 neighboring stars that orbit each other at a distance of approximately 0.5 light years. So I guess it's a better system than our solar system, and so on. So what are the laws of space? Solutions in this field are still yet to come. But let's go back to Canettis, who wrote about mass symbols that could thus evoke masses, even if people are not aware of them at all. The same principle applies to different masses. In his essay, Canettis himself presents these invisible masses that have a huge impact on the real world. Due to the power in the human imagination, they are perceived as real, although it is impossible to prove that they exist. The leader of the nation may not be present at all to direct and maintain the mass. See new charges in subatomic theories, which are characterized by masterlessness. However, Canettis by no means excluded the leader, both in his essay and in other works. Canettis gives the leader a special gateway, namely he writes about the delusional leader, whom Canettis describes as follows: a delusional ruler in whom we undoubtedly also sees Hitler. The rise of National Socialism and World War II are depicted here. Similarly, the work of Canettis himself, his escape from Austria, as well as the phase of intensified work on the work, mass and power. According to an author named Kunau, later writer, National Socialism became a direct obstacle to the masses and power. The book by Canettis. This is not at all obvious at first glance when reading the work. After reading the essay Mass and Power, Barnow puts forward the thesis that National Socialism is also the main theme of the work. However, Canettis does not focus solely on masses and power in the contemporary or World War II context to explain, but rather to discover the sources of these phenomena and thus answer the questions of why people choose to become part of the crowd and what the source of claims to power lies in the people. For this purpose, the reader of the essay is provided with various stories and myths. The writer opens a world in which the reader has the same mass drive and same need for power, and in both cases, both modern men and members of a primitive tribe have such a need. Canettis does not warn against masses and does not try to give advice on how and what to do to prevent the formation of masses, but also offers a proposed solution. This is to protect against negative mass forms in the future. This will be the case when summarizing the term transformation. Power is shown as a counter-principle of power, or rather something like it, which requires depriving others of power, which for Canettis is also a transformation, a natural feature of man, and which in the modern world is in danger of being forgotten. Canettis sees delusional manifestations of this in some mental illnesses, the loss of which leads to a person's rigidity. Canettis describes another pathological character through which a loss of transformation is experienced, delusional attributes of those in power. Capable only of dissembling, he uses commands, transforming others to keep his power alive. Canettis has left a thorn in people's lives that people cannot get rid of, despite many attempts. But through the transformation that takes place in people, primarily through art, moving from a compassion to reciprocity, something can be saved and preserved. According to Canettis, there is hope for a world without fear. The so-called command jumps and without building delusional mass forms. Canettis' concept of mass and power is, despite its detail, not very clear. The description contained in the essay itself becomes clear only after reading these other works, especially autobiographical ones, which provides a first-hand insight into the event of the 20th century. The purpose of the essay is to focus on mass and power in a cultural historical context. You can analyze the time in which the essay was written, the connection between the central ideas of the essay and the mass events of the first half of the 20th century could be explained in more detail. Canettis' solution concept is like an option against future destructive social and personal manifestations, visible mass. Here I would like to refer to contemporary mass symbols as symbols of certain mass forms: rain, river, forest, grain, sand and pile, in contrast, as it were, to fire and sea as mass symbols that represent all the properties of masses. I would draw attention to the literary nature of life in the writer Elias Canettis. See his German work Blendung. Finally, I refer interested readers to other works. In the scene from A Walk Through the Cemetery, see an important fragment of the work Masses and Power. I reveal what I believe to be the writer's truth. Freedom in time is overcoming death, survival in the world and in the immortal work. This is the Canettis approach. Blendung, shining this task, falls on people through transformation and with it at the same time on trying to improve humanity. Who has the working mass and power? To understand this, it is difficult to avoid Canettis' other works. As I said, this is exactly the case and vice versa. The interpretation of his works is only possible to a limited extent without work, mass and power. In relation to Canettis' entire oeuvre, this essay precisely reflects what it deals with this example presented in Canettis' life, namely, the center around which all of his oeuvre was simultaneously focused on an attempt to find and answer the question of the nature of mass, the question of human nature in general.